Hey guys, so I thought I would actually get out of my house for once and be in nature. So this is different. But today I want to close out our chapter on World War II and really kind of bring to a close all of the different moving parts that are going on in World War II. And so we have three big objectives that you should be able to do by the time we've finished this video, which should take us about 20 minutes. Firstly, our goal is we need to understand how Hitler and the Axis powers started to lose that big advantage and that big momentum they had from the beginning with Blitzkrieg. Secondly, we need to figure out how the United States got involved in the whole mess. And then last but not least, we need to figure out how both World War II in Europe and in the Pacific came to an end. So those are our objectives for this. So a little bit of this is probably going to be review for you. I'm going to breeze right on through this if possible. Blitzkrieg is a German term that you should be familiar with from a previous lesson. It means lightning war. And Germany has really, really become the expert for using this strategy to target weak points in the enemy's lines, throwing everything you've got at it to really penetrate the lines of defense of both sides of the war, the French side and the Russian side. And so at this point, Germany is really, really, really winning. Most of Europe is taking the L every time they come up against the Germans. A great example of this is the Battle of Dunkirk. At this point in really the early phase of the war, we see Blitzkrieg at its finest. Hitler throws everything he's got at the British and the French, who are on the defensive, and it's in land that they already know. But ultimately, with using the strategy of Blitzkrieg, breaking enemy lines, Hitler manages to chase the British out of continental Europe and leave France in a surrendering position. Ultimately, Hitler takes Paris and puts France under his rule. Here you can see below in my notes that the northern half of France gets absorbed by Germany, and the bottom half of France is allowed to have its own Vichy government. It's really just a puppet for Hitler. At this point, Hitler has the vast majority of the territory of continental Europe under his power. The British flee and they go back to the British Isles, but they're chased there too. Using the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, Hitler tries to really demoralize and depress the British to the point to where they would throw in the towel also. But they don't. The British manage to persevere using their government's campaign of really playing a mental game here of convincing its people to keep calm and carry on. The British managed to outlast without fully surrendering to Hitler. So this is really the first challenge to Hitler's power. In addition, Hitler is fighting in the colonies and in the open waters. He's using his U-Boot, Unterseeboot fleet of submarines to target the British and target really anyone else out there. He's getting a little stretched thin at this point. We start to see the Allies, the British, the French, starting to actually make some gains in the Mediterranean, but he's still winning the major battles. Despite the fact that he's gradually getting more and more surrounded. All the Allies need is another little pep in their step to be able to pull this off. In Africa, for instance, Germany is still motivated by imperialism, and they're picking fights with the British over their colonies and the French over their colonies. But ultimately, by 1943, the war in Africa is over, and the Allies have the upper hand. So by 1943, Hitler is losing his momentum. He's still got a lot of territory, but he's losing his momentum. We'll know from our previous section that Hitler's big downfall at this point in 1943 is the Battle of Stalingrad. He throws a ton of German soldiers at Stalingrad in Russia, which he perceives as a weak point for the Russians, that he could potentially blow through Stalingrad, curve back around, and take Moscow. Unfortunately, he made the really, really dumb move, like Napoleon before him, 130 years before him, of invading during the winter. And Stalingrad is an absolute disaster for the Germans, and they must retreat. This is seen as really the first big scale sign that Hitler is really going to have to scramble, that he is not going to be able to count on his previous strategies, his previous techniques, his previous numbers to win this war. Now, we need to talk about the other half of the war. During all of this, war is going on in the Pacific. The Japanese, who are in the Axis with the Germans and the Italians have already been expanding and taking control in China. You'll notice from other sections of either this class or U.S. history discussion on the rape of Nanjing, a massive, massive war crime by the Japanese on innocent people in China in 1937. By this time, Japan is trying to do the same thing Hitler's doing, but they're doing it over in the Pacific Ocean. This expansionism and their ultranationalism leads them to attack Pearl Harbor. The United States has started to limit trade access to the Japanese. They resent this. They want an empire. They're going to get it, and they fight or they attack the Hawaiian base of Pearl Harbor. This causes the United States to declare war on Japan and formally enter World War II. This is 1941. They're going to declare war eventually on Germany and Italy, but again, that's a European war, and not all Americans yet are in this place where they feel like we need to get involved in Europe. So really, in the 40s, the early 40s, while Europe is dealing with the whole Hitler storyline, the United States is just focusing on getting, not necessarily revenge, but shutting down the Japanese Empire. So we start to fight against the Japanese. And one of the things that we know is the geography of the Pacific is a whole bunch of islands. And so we're going to get into this group of kind of leapfrogging, take an island and then kind of build that up. Hop to the next island with your offense while you're preparing your soldiers on the original island. Then have those fresh soldiers leapfrog over to the next island, and eventually you're going to make a chain, one after the other, all the way making it up to Japan is the thought, starting with the Battle of Midway. And the stuff is going great at the beginning, honestly. Now, the Americans really, really, really are distraught over what happened at Pearl Harbor. And so when we start to see the winds and the winds and the winds in these islands, it's real messy. It's really, really ugly. We could go on for hours of the gruesome battles that went on in the Pacific that the Americans led. But ultimately, the United States is by and large getting win after win here, with some losses. But it starts to kind of charge up the United States, the Americans, to really feel more motivated for our country. Now you see here in red on this map, this is where Japan is, right around the middle point, late point of 1942. So this is after Pearl Harbor. They're already fighting with the United States. And so we're just going to go, if you want to follow my cursor, we're just kind of going all the way from the Gilberts and New Guinea down here, and we're going to kind of trace up a line of leapfrogging through Saipan, the Marianas Islands, and eventually we're going to land up here in Okinawa and Iwo Jima, two islands that are really close to Japan. But we've learned something along the way, and this is crucial. The Japanese fight different. They fight different than anyone else because of what we've seen before, that ultranationalism, that homogenous society where people are acting and thinking and behaving similarly. The level of intensity that the Japanese are fighting is far more than Americans want to surmount. That is not to say that we are weak and the Japanese were strong in this situation. It is to say that the Japanese are ready to line up and fight to the death, point blank. And the Americans here are not, they're on an offensive, right? They're not on the defensive here. So the Americans are not willing to risk as much. An actual evaluation is made of how many soldiers, how many Americans we'd lose if we actually put boots on the ground in Japan, and it's in the 7 digits. By the time we island hopped, by the time we leapfrogged all the way up to the main core of Japan, liberating places like the Philippines and Guinea, we know it's got to be different. We can't use the old bag of tricks. This is where the A-bomb comes in. The Manhattan Project, run by Robert Oppenheimer, has found a way to stably use atomic technology in an explosive device. And the United States, understanding that we would lose 7 digits of soldiers, we're in the millions, potentially, million plus American soldiers would be lost trying to shut Japan down, knowing that the Japanese are willing to fight to the death, knowing that this is shaking up the entire continent and the entire ocean. The White House under President Truman decides to detonate the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on the 6th of August, thinking that effectively the vaporization of tens of thousands of civilians would cause the Japanese government to surrender. But it doesn't really come too much of a surprise when they don't. The Japanese see 50,000 of their own people killed instantly and more from radiation and cancers later on. they see this happen, and the government is still not ready to surrender. It's a piece of honor, and it really kind of rattles the White House. The government thinks that that would be enough, but Japan operates differently. It's a different culture, and we have to respect their approach to what to them was a war crime. The Japanese at the time perceived the Americans rolling in here with this atomic bomb, vaporizing average people like you and me. They saw this as a war crime. So to surrender to that, surrender to what they saw as the villains for doing this, also didn't vibe with a lot of Japanese. But when we do drop a second bomb, a larger bomb, over the port city of Nagasaki, or Nagasaki in southwest Japan, Japan decides to surrender. It's brutal. Hiroshima, they lose 50,000 Japanese. Nagasaki loses 70,000 Japanese. Those are just the numbers that we can estimate. On the right, if you want to glance at this, is the press release from the president himself the day the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. It Truman has to be careful. He knows that he signed off on a world-changing decree. By dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, he now knows that all wars from then on will be carried out with this technology at hand. He knows it's inevitable that it's going to spread to a variety of different places. Look at how he appeals to the audience here in his last paragraph of this excerpt. He says, "It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East." Truman understands the gravity. And now you, as the listener, as the historian here, you have to decide, was this the right decision? Was the dropping of these two bombs, Little Man over Hiroshima and Little Boy, and Fat Man over Nagasaki, was that the correct decision of Truman to do given the circumstances? And that's a personal decision that you're going to have to reflect on. Let's take a look at some of the evidence from the explosions. On the right, we see here the satellite imagery of Hiroshima before and after the dropping of the atomic bombs. You see the entire city core is virtually evaporated here. In Nagasaki, same thing, even with a larger bomb. The United States, we chose to detonate both bombs up in the air as they were falling from the planes. We knew that if we dropped the bombs on the soil, that they would never be able to recover. They would never be able to plant crops again. It would be over based on the atomic technology. And so we blew the atomic bombs up over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the air so that it would cause the damage we wanted to, but allow them to rebuild, that the soil wouldn't be irradiated. Now my neighbor has pulled out the weed whacker, so let's finish this up in a second. Okay. Now we're indoors. So basically, at this point, the United States has carried out basically the evaporization of over 100,000 Japanese people. And to put that into perspective of what that looks like geographically, let's use a tool called Nuke Map. In Nuke Map, which is a quick Google, let's go to it right now. In Nuke Map, you're able to simulate the dropping of the atomic bombs anywhere on Earth. So let's do a trial run of the technology they used at the time. So first and foremost, let's simulate Little Boy Hiroshima. So we're going to go ahead and blow this thing up over our school because we know the area, and so we can kind of relate to the scope of it. So let's go to Northern High School. We're going to go ahead and select, this is always in the way, we're going to go ahead and select the Hiroshima bomb. We're going to select casualties and radioactive fallout to show the impact. And we're going to have it be an airburst because the bomb was detonated in the air above the city. Let's hit detonate. So we can use this map to understand the actual impact of the bomb in different places. We see, for instance, in this first ring, there's a key to the right. In this first ring is the destruction of and basically vaporization within this first kind of yellow ring from the fireball, nothing survives. Nothing, basically concrete will be pulverized and be around, but everything else that's organic tissue will be completely wiped away. The blast damage radius is our next ring, this kind of red ring here. These are things that will be destroyed from the pressure of the explosion. Unlikely that anyone is going to survive inside of the red ring. In the green, stuff's going to be blown apart, and you're probably going to have to unbury yourself from the wreckage. The biggest threat in here is you've been exposed to the radiation. So within the green circle, you're going to see people who, if you survive the destruction of whatever building you are in or getting blown off of your feet, if you're outside, you also are going to be exposed to high levels of radiation. Outside of that, in the moderate blast damage radius, some buildings will survive. But again, there's still the threat of fire, there's still the threat of heat, and there's still the threat of radiation. This ring right here in orange, if you are not shielded or not behind something, you are going to be experiencing really deep burns over whatever part of your body is exposed. So if you're out in the open, anywhere within this orange ring, you're probably going to be experiencing severe burns. You may not be injured from the actual flying shrapnel or material, but you're going to face some serious injuries. And then anywhere here in this large ring on the outside, this is the light blast damage radius. This is where there will be some destruction. You may be consequently injured by something falling, some roof caving in, or pieces flying. So really, it's not safe to be anywhere in this circle, and definitely within the orange ring, you're going to have a significant chance of death if you are exposed. Let's simulate this over a larger city. Let's simulate Little Boy over New York City. So let's go to Manhattan, New York. If you detonate the bomb over Manhattan, and if you've ever been to Manhattan in New York, you know the scope of this. We can see Central Park kind of hanging out right in the center of that. If we hit detonate, we can see what that would look like in today's number of fatalities based on the density of the population. Note over here that there's going to be 166,000 people would not survive, and another 430,000, most of them are in that outer ring, are going to be seriously injured. So this technology was terrifying. Truman knew, and the United States government knew when we dropped the bombs, this is now going to be a technology that's accessible. Let's go back to our school right now, and let's see what it looks like when the technology develops more. So we've already simulated the detonation of Little Boy. Fat Man, a slightly larger, it's about a quarter larger bomb or so over Nagasaki, gets detonated, and we can see here the inner rings are even wider, right? But the technology's out of the bag. Pandora's box has been opened, and now, since 1945, countries on Earth have expanded their ability to use this weaponry. Let's simulate with a few other things that we've got going on in the world and arsenals that exist today. The Minuteman III, for instance, this is a bomb, a missile that the United States possesses a lot of. They're not going to publish the map up on Google Maps of where to find them for good reason. Let's take a look at this. This is a very standard one that we have in our arsenal that we're not about to be using anytime soon, but they're out there in missile silos. Minuteman III, you can see here, if it was detonated over Northern High School, then you would lose 31,000 people with 142,000 injuries. For those of you that are familiar with the Grand Rapids area, basically we're going all the way out to Standale Walker, all the way back almost to Lowell, the suburbs of Lowell, will face some sort of damage. But anywhere within that orange ring is going to be a pretty nasty experience, and the risk of death is high. But there are additional technologies that have been invented. Let's keep going. Let's continue simulating this. Let's try the Minuteman I. The Minuteman I, not a ton is known about it by yours truly. I'm familiar with the Minuteman III, but let's take a look at what happens with this warhead that exists in the United States arsenal, or has. This has created a massive blast radius. This involves pretty much the annihilation of all of downtown Grand Rapids, Michigan. The numbers on the right side are skyrocketing in comparison to the original bomb, which is still an extraordinary number, unfathomable, right? But there's more, because the technology and the militarism we've studied before is still at play, even after World War II. Maybe nationalism is going to take a hit, but you bet the militarism is still going to exist. We're going to take a look at Dongfang. Dongfeng is an intercontinental ballistic missile, or an ICBM. China owns this one. And for those of you that are familiar with the area, we're starting to see Lake Michigan appear. We're seeing damage all the way from, what is this over here? We're looking into Allendale, downtown Allendale, almost all the way to Ionia is the breadth of the damage. Anywhere in this orange circle here, you have a very high probability of dying of your injuries. Anywhere within this blue one here, it's almost certain. So this is what China has, but there's more. The technology is spiraled out of control. Well, not really out of control, because it's very intentional what a lot of governments do when they invest in these programs, but the scale has gotten huge. The United States, we dropped Ivy Mike out in the Pacific as a test of the technology. So we've done this. You can see here now it shows radiation. If we zoom out to Michigan, you can see here with the winds, the patterns of the winds, the westerly winds, how much people will be exposed to radiation because of the bomb, even though the blast circle is not much different from the Dongfeng Chinese bomb we saw before. The United States, we have dropped Ivy Mike, or I'm sorry, this was Ivy Mike, Castle Bravo. This was a test that we did in addition. So this one is also extraordinarily impactful. And again, anywhere within this blue circle, you are going to have a tough time pulling through. But the one that is the most terrifying is probably Tsar Bomba. The Russians in the Cold War tested Tsar Bomba within the confines of Russia to see how much mastery they have over this technology. So this bomb has been detonated on Earth before. Let's detonate it now. For those of you who know Grand Rapids or West Michigan geography, we're looking at damage all the way from the coast almost to the capital of Michigan, Lansing. I give you all these examples of the bombs and these extraordinary numbers here. Notice that fatalities are more likely than injuries here, because really within this circle, the way the geometry works, you have a higher chance of dying than just being injured from a bomb detonation like Tsar Bomba. I give you all these examples for you to understand that the detonation of Little Boy over Hiroshima ended warfare as we knew it up until then, and began a new chapter of warfare in which everyone in the world was conscious that this technology exists. We can't go back. We can't hit Control-Z, undo the knowledge that bombs and bomb-making technology using nuclear science exists. It's a thing in play now. The question I pose to you is this: was it the right thing to do at the time? If you were Truman, would you have hit the button and sent Little Boy to detonate over Hiroshima and 3 days later Fat Man over Nagasaki? That one's on you. So let's see the results of the war. You can think about that one a little bit, but we're going to go back to our slides to wrap this up. So at this point, Japan is going to surrender on August 9th in 1945, but we need to step back a little bit because we also need to figure out how the United States got involved in Europe. The United States is over the war. We've already declared war on Germany, on Italy, and having seen what Hitler's been doing with enemies across the European and African continents, the United States is motivated to put an end to this. In 1944, we coordinate with the Allied forces to bring 150,000 soldiers to the beach in Normandy, the coast of Normandy, to retake France, liberate France from the Nazis. On June 6, 1944, we drop in a ton of American soldiers. We put boots on the ground very rapidly in Normandy. And this is one of the most famous military engagements in our culture because of what it meant. It meant we put American soldiers on the line to enter in a war that was not our own and to collaborate with allies in resisting what really was known at that time as an evil force. The cover's blown. Nazis are not just, and Hitler is not just the enemy, but the things they are doing between the Holocaust and the total war strategies that they are taking, or that they are implementing in their fight, have really, really shaken the world. And the United States, leads in Normandy Beach this attempt to free France after France was absorbed by the Germans after Dunkirk. Eventually, though, the war fizzles out. The Russians are chasing the Germans back to Germany after Germany lost Stalingrad. So over on the east side, the Russians are chasing the Nazis back. And on the west side, after D-Day, the British, the Americans, the French, the Canadians, the Australians, they are starting to push the Germans back into Germany from there as well. So it's slowly condensing in on Germany. Even though with battles like the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler tries to make a good last resistance, and it doesn't work. So the Axis powers in 1945 are starting to just fall apart. Finally, in Italy, Mussolini, the dictator, the fascist dictator Mussolini, is overthrown and killed. The Allies invade Italy, take over Italy, which now has to drop out of war. We liberate the Balkans, who've been through enough, as we know from this class. And up in Germany, the first ones to make it to Berlin, the Russians make it there first. They get there May 2nd, but 2 days prior, Hitler had already put a gun in his mouth. He killed himself, knowing full well what would likely happen to him if he was taken alive. May 8th, Germany surrenders. And that is the end of World War II in Europe. So we know from the dates, this is all happening in 1945. So stuff's going on in the Pacific and Europe at the same time. 45 is chaotic. Realistically, though, if we think about it, the war wholly ends in Japan, because that occurs in August, 3 months after this. So Europe VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, is in May of 45, and VJ Day, Victory in Japan, is in August of 45, and that is essentially the end of the war. We'll talk a little bit about the consequences of the war later on, but I really want you to reflect a little bit on this. We know that war changed. Did Truman do the right thing? That is up for you to decide.